Have you ever wondered what it would be like to carry a secret capable of shaking the foundations of an entire nation? The day was only just beginning, but George already felt the weight of exhaustion settling on his shoulders, as if the years he'd spent at Hampton Court were heavier that particular morning. The usually calm, refreshing morning air was charged with an unusual sense of anticipation. George kept his slow and measured pace, strolling through the gardens with a careful, practiced eye, adjusting flowers, checking bushes, and removing dead leaves. The soft fragrance of freshly bloomed roses filled the air, mingling with the moist scent of freshly cut grass. Dew still sparkled on petals and leaves, reflecting the first rays of the rising sun. George took a deep breath, letting the fresh air fill his lungs, trying to shake off the unease that had accompanied him since he awoke. For him, Hampton Court was more than just a garden. It was a place where he had built a life where every inch bore his mark, and where his footsteps echoed familiarly between the stone paths and hedges. The century-old trees seemed to whisper ancient secrets, their leaves gently rustling in the morning breeze. He was near the old oak when he saw something unexpected, two figures slowly advancing, almost unnoticed, along the stone path between the flower beds. George squinted, trying to focus on the silhouettes moving cautiously, like shadows dissolving in the mist. The first to reveal himself was Prince Alexander, his tall frame and distinct posture unmistakable, even in the dim light of dawn. The other, however, was less obvious. Lord Andrew Lennox. Known for his sharp criticism of the monarchy, Lennox was notorious for his willingness to question the crown. George felt his heart race. What was Prince Alexander, heir to the throne, doing in what appeared to be a secret meeting with Lord Lennox, one of the monarchy's fiercest critics? The incongruity of the scene made George instinctively hide behind a nearby bush, his curiosity momentarily overpowering his sense of duty. The pair was close and the tension between them was palpable. George couldn't catch specific words, but could discern the tone, low and urgent. Their gestures were controlled and rapid, as if each movement could betray an unspoken emotion, suggesting more than a casual conversation. George noticed when Lennox briefly placed a hand on the prince's shoulder, a fleeting touch, but laden with meaning. He felt the weight of that gesture, as if it carried a plea for trust or a silent entreaty. What could be happening between these two men? And why would a prince meet so furtively with a politician, known for his outspoken views on the royal family? George knew that no other pair of eyes would witness this scene. And you? Would you have the courage to bear such a disturbing secret alone? George withdrew, slipping away quietly while keeping his eyes fixed on the two figures. It was the start of a question he knew would not leave him anytime soon. Back in the toolshed, the thought lingered. Could something be so profound, a secret so powerful, that it demanded a clandestine dawn meeting? The day proceeded with a palpable tension, as if the garden itself were restless. Every trim of a plant, every watering felt heavy. The fragrance of the flowers, which usually brought him peace and purpose, now seemed to blend with a persistent sense of doubt. The thought of the secret meeting between the prince and Lennox occupied his mind like a thorn. As he worked, George couldn't help but look over his shoulder, half expecting to see the figures of the prince and Lennox again. But the gardens remained quiet, as if nothing had happened. Only the occasional breeze rustling the leaves and the distant song of birds broke the silence. As the sun rose higher in the sky, George felt the weight of the secret growing. He knew that what he had witnessed was not something he could simply ignore. Yet he also understood the risks of getting involved in royal matters. The loyalty he had always felt for his work and the palace now seemed to conflict with a greater sense of duty. At the end of the day, exhausted both physically and mentally, George put his tools away in the shed. The smell of earth and freshly cut grass clung to his clothes, but not even the comforting familiarity of his work could dispel the unease he felt. Walking home, the long shadows of twilight seemed to hide more secrets, and George couldn't help but wonder, how far would he go to uncover the truth? And more importantly, what would he do with it once he found it? Have you ever felt the crushing weight of a secret you couldn't share? What would it be like to bear alone the knowledge of something that could change the course of history? That afternoon, a messenger found him in the middle of the garden, his face serious, and delivered a message from Clark, the head of security at Hampton Court. Clark was a stern man, with restrained gestures and an ever-cold expression. He knew George well and saw him as an exemplary employee, but he had always maintained a careful distance. "Alcott, the head of security, would like to speak with you," said the messenger, looking at him with a sympathetic yet curious expression. George felt a knot form in his throat. His heart began to beat faster, and he couldn't help but wonder if somehow Clark knew about what he had witnessed that morning. Trying to stay calm, George nodded to the messenger and started walking toward Clark's office. The walk down the palace corridors felt endless. Every step echoed off the stone walls, amplifying the tension he felt. The old portraits on the walls seemed to watch him, as if they were silent witnesses to his inner turmoil. Upon reaching the office door, George hesitated for a moment. He took a deep breath, trying to steady his nerves, and knocked softly. Clark's deep voice answered immediately, inviting him in. George approached Clark's office with a lump in his throat. As he entered, the head of security sat with his fingers intertwined on the desk, gaze fixed. It was as if he had been waiting for him with ruthless patience. "Sit down, Alcott," Clark ordered, pointing to the chair in front of his desk. His voice was calm but heavy with authority. George felt the weight of that command and obeyed, folding his arms in his lap and keeping his head bowed in a posture of respect. The silence in the office was oppressive, broken only by the constant ticking of an old clock on the wall. "I hear you were near the old oak this morning," Clark began, his gaze steady, cold. "Did anything catch your attention there, anything unusual?" George felt his heart race. Clark seemed to be studying him, as if trying to read his thoughts. He had to choose his words carefully. "No, sir. I was just tending to the plants, as I do every morning," George replied, trying to keep his tone neutral. The answer didn't seem to satisfy Clark, who continued to watch him with a skeptical expression. The head of security leaned forward slightly, his eyes never leaving George's face. "You know, Alcott, certain areas require discretion," Clark continued, in a warning tone. "I hope you understand that your loyalty is crucial to the security of this place. If you see or hear something that does not concern you, come directly to me. Anything." George nodded, the weight of the veiled threat in Clark's voice even more apparent. He could feel beads of sweat forming on his forehead and struggled to keep a neutral expression. "I understand perfectly, sir," George replied, his voice slightly shaky. "I've always been loyal to Hampton Court and intend to remain so." Clark leaned back in his chair, his eyes still fixed on George. For a moment, silence took over the room, heavy and loaded with tension. "Very well, Alcott," Clark finally said. "You may return to your work. Remember what we talked about." George stood, feeling his legs weak. He made a small bow and turned to leave the office. As his hand touched the doorknob, Clark's voice stopped him again. "And Alcott," George turned to face him, "keep your eyes open. You never know what might be happening in the gardens." With a final nod, George left the office, closing the door behind him. He walked quickly down the corridors, eager to return to the outdoors, to the relative safety of the gardens. When he left the office, he felt as though he carried a guilt he couldn't explain. What did Clark know? Or rather, what did Clark suspect? He realized he was being watched and that, from now on, his every move would be monitored. Clark represented something beyond his authority. He was a symbol of the power and secrets that surrounded the palace. Would you keep silent, knowing you might be witnessing the unfolding of something important and perhaps dangerous? George returned to the gardens, but the work that had once brought him so much peace now seemed an arduous task. Every movement felt scrutinized, every glance in his direction loaded with suspicion. The weight of the secret he bore seemed to grow heavier with each passing minute. As he pruned a bush, George couldn't help but wonder what would happen if he decided to speak up. Who would believe the word of a mere gardener against that of a prince or Lord Lennox, and what would be the consequences for him and his family? The sun was beginning to set, painting the sky with shades of orange and pink, but George barely noticed the beauty around him. His mind was full of doubts and fears. He knew that whatever decision he made in the coming days could change not only his life, but potentially the course of the nation's history. As he put his tools away at the end of the day, George looked once more at the old oak, now a dark silhouette against the twilight sky. The secret he had witnessed there that morning now seemed like a shadow that followed him, an invisible yet undeniable weight. Walking home, George wondered, how far would he go to protect the truth? And more importantly, at what cost? Have you ever wondered how a small piece of paper could change the course of an entire life? How hastily written words could bear the weight of a deadly secret? The tension from that conversation with Clark was still fresh in George's mind, but he tried to shake it off as he returned to work. What he had witnessed that morning left him uneasy, but his responsibility to the gardens was a temporary relief. Taking care of the plants and flowers always brought him a sense of serenity. But that morning, each movement seemed watched. Each pruning cut seemed to echo in the hidden corners of Hampton Court. The morning sun warmed his skin as he moved among the flower beds. The scent of freshly opened flowers filled the air, mingling with the smell of damp earth. Bees buzzed lazily from flower to flower, oblivious to the drama unfolding around them. George knelt to examine a rosebush, his calloused hands moving with the skill of years of practice. As he worked, he couldn't help but notice the contrast between the serene beauty of the garden and the turmoil of his thoughts. Passing near a rose bed, he noticed something strange on the ground. It was a crumpled piece of paper swaying in the light breeze, almost as if calling for his attention. He looked around, but there was no one nearby. The garden was silent, except for the occasional bird call and the gentle rustling of leaves. With a racing heart, George bent down to pick up the paper. His hands trembled slightly as he unfolded it, the sound of the crinkling paper seeming to echo in the stillness of the garden. Smoothing the paper, he saw hurried handwriting, the letters slightly smudged. The security of the crown depends on silence. Any slip will be considered treason. A deep chill ran through George. This wasn't a casual note. It was a clear warning, a message directed at someone who knew too much. He clenched the note in his fingers, his heart pounding as he looked around, feeling exposed. That note was a message leaving no doubt about the dangers of going further. If you were in his place, would you have the courage to carry on, or would you give in to the growing fear inside you? The implied threat in those words felt all too real. He tucked the note into his apron pocket, but couldn't shake the weight of the discovery. With every step he took, the feeling that he was being watched grew, as if invisible eyes were following him among the flower beds. But a silent force, an impulse he barely understood, kept him from backing down. The rest of the day passed in a blur for George. His hands continued the mechanical work of tending to the garden, but his mind was far away, lost in a whirlwind of thoughts and possibilities. Who had written that note? Was it a general warning, or was it specifically directed at someone? And more importantly, how did it connect with the secret meeting he had witnessed? As night fell, George returned to his small house on the outskirts of Hampton Court. The note felt like it was burning in his pocket, a constant reminder of the danger now surrounding him. Sitting at his kitchen table under the dim light of a single bulb, he read the words over and over, as if he could extract more meaning from them. The security of the crown depends on silence. The phrase echoed in his mind. What secrets could be so terrible that they threatened the very monarchy? And why had he, a mere gardener, found himself in the middle of it all? George barely slept that night. His dreams were filled with threatening shadows and whispering voices. He woke before dawn, sweating and restless. As he prepared for another day's work, the decision he needed to make weighed on him like a dark cloud. Should he ignore everything he'd seen and heard, bury the note and his suspicions, and continue his life as if nothing had happened? Or should he seek answers, knowing that every step in that direction could lead him into even greater danger? Have you ever faced a choice that could change not only your life, but potentially the fate of an entire nation? How would you decide between the safety of silence and the risk of truth? In the days that followed, the pressure of the secret he carried became almost unbearable. The weight of the furtive meeting, the threatening note, the ambiguous conversation with Clark. Every element seemed to intertwine in a mystery he knew he couldn't ignore. He needed a way out, someone he could trust to confide in and help him understand what to do. George spent his days in the garden, performing his usual tasks, but his mind was constantly divided. Every unexpected sound startled him. Every glance from a co-worker seemed loaded with suspicion. The note, which he now kept hidden at home, was a constant presence in his thoughts. One afternoon, while pruning the roses near the old oak, George made his decision. He couldn't bear this burden alone. He needed help, someone who could look at the situation from the outside and perhaps help him understand what to do. It was then that he decided to seek out Charles Martin, an old friend and journalist whose experience in investigations and knack for scandal were undeniable. Charles and George had grown up together in a small town not far from Hampton Court. While George had chosen a quiet life tending the royal gardens, Charles had pursued a career in investigative journalism, always on the hunt for the next big story. George knew that trusting Charles was a risk. After all, journalists made their living by exposing secrets, but he also knew that if anyone could help him navigate these troubled waters, it was Charles. With trembling hands, George picked up his phone and dialed Charles's number. Every ring seemed to last an eternity, and George nearly hung up several times before he heard his friend's familiar voice on the other end of the line. "Charles? It's George. I need your help. It's something big." Charles's voice sounded concerned. "George, what's wrong? Are you all right?" "Not here, not over the phone," George replied, glancing nervously around. "Can we meet? Somewhere. Discreet." There was a pause on the other end of the line, and George could almost hear the gears turning in Charles's mind. Finally, Charles replied, "Of course, George, I know a place. We'll meet tomorrow at 7 p.m. at Café Obscuro. It's a few blocks from the station. It's quiet. No one will bother us there," George agreed, feeling a mixture of relief and apprehension. It was done. There was no going back now. The next day, the hours dragged on as George anxiously awaited the meeting. Every minute felt like an eternity, and he could barely focus on his tasks. When the time finally came, George changed clothes quickly and left, trying not to draw attention. Café Obscuro was exactly as its name suggested, a small, discreet establishment tucked away in a narrow alley. Heavy curtains covered the windows, and the dim interior lighting created an atmosphere of palpable privacy. Charles was already there when George arrived, sitting at a table at the back of the cafe. His face showed a mixture of concern and curiosity. "George, it's good to see you," Charles said, shaking his friend's hand. "Now tell me, what's going on?" George looked around, making sure no one was watching them, then began to speak. The words flowed in a steady stream, like a dam finally breaking. He told Charles about the secret meeting he had witnessed, about his conversation with Clark, and finally, about the threatening note. Charles listened in silence, his face growing increasingly serious as George revealed each detail. When George finished, there was a tense moment of silence. "George, this is much more than just a meeting," Charles said, his voice low and calm. "If this involves Prince Alexander and Lord Lennox, and a threat as explicit as this, you could be dealing with an explosive situation." George looked away, uncertain but also relieved. He needed to hear that, needed to know there was someone willing to believe what he had experienced, someone willing to help him understand. "I know it's dangerous," George replied, trying to control his tone, "but I can't just ignore it. There's something they're hiding, and it seems important, Charles, too important to be ignored." Charles nodded, a look of determination appearing on his face. "If we're going to do this, George, we'll need to be careful. We need evidence, something concrete, and that's going to take more effort. We can't just rely on assumptions. Every detail will matter." George nodded. He knew his friend was right. They would need irrefutable proof, something to back up every word. They both knew they were stepping into a path with no return. "Where do we start?" George asked, feeling a mix of fear and excitement. Charles thought for a moment before answering. "First, we need to establish a pattern. You said you saw the Prince and Lennox meeting once. We need to know if this is a regular occurrence. Do you think you could observe that area of the garden more closely over the next few days?" George hesitated. The idea of deliberately spying made him feel uncomfortable, but he knew it was necessary. "I can try. I'll have to be very careful, especially after Clark's warning." "Good," Charles said. "Meanwhile, I'll do some discreet research on Lord Lennox. See if I can find any connection between him and the Prince that could explain these secret meetings." The two friends spent the next few hours discussing strategies and possibilities. When they finally parted ways, it was already late at night. George returned home feeling both relieved to have shared his secret and apprehensive about Wa. In the days that followed, George remained vigilant. Every spare moment was dedicated to discreetly watching the area around the old oak. He adjusted his gardening routines to spend more time in that part of the gardens, always alert for any suspicious movement. His vigilance was rewarded on the fourth morning. Once again, he saw Prince Alexander and Lord Lennox meeting furtively. This time, George was prepared. With trembling hands, he used his phone to discreetly take some photos of the encounter. That evening, he met with Charles again, eager to share his discovery. "This is excellent, George," Charles said, examining the photos. "It's the proof we needed that these meetings are regular, but we still need to know why." Charles then shared his own findings. He had uncovered some intriguing connections between Lord Lennox and certain political pressure groups known for their critical stance on the monarchy. It seems Lennox has been involved in discussions about fairly radical constitution, the kind of thing that could really shake up the monarchy if it became public. George felt a shiver run down his spine. "Do you think the prince could be collaborating with that?" Charles shrugged. "It's possible. Or maybe he's trying to stop Lennox. We can't be sure yet, but one thing is clear. Whatever's going on, it's big and potentially very dangerous." Walking home that night, George couldn't help but wonder what he had gotten himself into. He was just a gardener, after all. How had he become central to such a complex and potentially dangerous political game? But one thing he knew for sure, there was no turning back now. He was committed, for better or worse. The truth needed to come out, no matter the cost. And you, dear reader, how far would you go in search of the truth, knowing that each step could take you deeper into a labyrinth of secrets and dangers? Have you ever wondered how the secrets of the past can shape the present? How decisions made decades ago can echo through time, affecting lives and destinies far beyond what anyone could imagine? After his meeting with Charles, George felt more determined, but also more apprehensive. The magnitude of what they were investigating was beginning to weigh on his shoulders. Every glance from a co-worker, every unexpected sound in the garden, seemed loaded with potential threat. A week after his last conversation with Charles, George received an encrypted message from his friend. Charles had uncovered something that could shed new light on the entire situation. They arranged to... When George arrived, Charles was already waiting, a thick file on the table in front of him. His face was pale and there were deep circles under his eyes, signs of sleepless nights. "George, what I found..." "It's bigger than we imagined," Charles began, his voice low and tense. "Do you remember Margaret Wilson?" George frowned, trying to recall. The name sounded vaguely familiar. "The old governess? The one who disappeared a few years ago?" Charles nodded gravely. "Exactly. Well, I managed to locate her diary." George's eyes widened in surprise. "How? I thought all her belongings had disappeared with her." "They did," Charles confirmed, "but I have my contacts. The diary was hidden in the old butler's library. Apparently Margaret entrusted it to him before she vanished." Charles opened the file and began to flip through the photocopied pages of the diary. "George, what's written here? It's incredible and frightening." That night, Charles and George gathered in secret to read Margaret's diary. They sat in George's small cottage, the dim light of a single lamp creating a nearly somber atmosphere. Charles opened the diary with steady but careful hands, as if he were handling a sacred object. The first pages were routine entries. Margaret described her daily tasks, important events at the palace, visits, and formal meetings. But as they progressed, the narrative took on a darker tone, a growing unease. Margaret seemed to have witnessed suspicious meetings, unusual behavior, and hushed discussions. In an entry dated 1984, Margaret mentioned Prince Alexander and Lord Lennox. "They speak in secret, and always at night," the passage read. "They talk about something that could change everything." George and Charles exchanged glances. The revelation was subtle, but indicated that these secretive meetings were not new. Prince Alexander and Lord Lennox had been involved in something that had endured Further along, Margaret noted, "If someone finds this diary, it's because the danger has finally reached me. There are truths that should remain hidden. What Alexander and Lennox share is too big and too dangerous." George felt a chill run through him. Margaret seemed to have written those words with the certainty that one day her secret would be discovered. The anguish in the phrases, the desperate and somber tone, all suggested that Margaret had known too much and had possibly paid for it with her life. "Charles, this is unbelievable," George whispered, his voice trembling. Margaret knew. She knew everything, decades ago. Charles nodded gravely. "And it seems that knowledge put her in danger. George, we need to be very careful. If what happened to Margaret is any indication, we're dealing with people who wouldn't hesitate to silence anyone who..." George felt a cold shiver down his spine. The reality of the danger they were facing suddenly seemed much more tangible. "What do we do now?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. Charles carefully closed the diary. "We need to keep investigating. Margaret left clues, I'm sure. We need to find out exactly what she knew and why it was so dangerous." The two friends spent the next few hours discussing strategies, analyzing every word in Margaret's diary, searching for connections and hidden meanings. When they finally parted ways, it was already dawn. George barely slept that night. His dreams were filled with threatening shadows and whispering voices. In a particularly vivid nightmare, he found himself running down the dark corridors of Hampton Court, pursued by a shadowy figure he knew somehow to be Clark. Would you face a mortal danger to reveal an uncomfortable truth, or would you preserve your silence to save your own life? The following days brought a frenzy of investigation for Charles and George. They needed to act with speed and caution. Every new detail Margaret revealed in her notes made the plot thicker. They discovered that Margaret had kept letters and documents, records of Alexander and Lennox's meetings. She mentioned people, places, and details they could use to draw a line between past and present. Charles, meticulous as ever, went further, digging through his newsroom's archives and even old newspapers. He found a few brief articles mentioning the disappearance of the governess Margaret Wilson, but none dared to suggest anything suspicious. Instead, the absence of information left an uncomfortable gap. Could the secrets Margaret kept have been buried so deeply that no one dared to unearth them? George noticed that Charles was becoming increasingly involved in the story, as if he himself were risking everything alongside him. George felt grateful, but also apprehensive. He knew that with every step they were getting closer to something monumental, and at the same time closer to an invisible danger. While walking through the old ruins in the garden one evening, Charles stopped and, in a serious gesture, placed a hand on George's shoulder. "Are you sure you want to go on, George? We only have fragments of a story, clues from a dark past. We might dig up things that should never see the light of day." George looked at him, feeling the weight of the choice. He had a comfortable life as a gardener, a quiet routine anyone would envy. But the truth called to him, like an irresistible echo. And if you were in his place, could you ignore the secrets knowing that you were closer than ever to the truth? He nodded, and Charles understood that there was no turning back. With Margaret's notes as a guide, Charles made a shocking discovery. He found hidden documents in the public archive mentioning a secret project called Operation Amethyst. According to the fragmented records, it was a confidential program aimed at protecting the monarchy's image at any cost. The files discreetly mentioned some of the methods employed: misinformation, bribes, and, if necessary, silencing. The mention of silencing made George shudder. It was precisely what seemed to have happened to Margaret Wilson. She knew too much and had been eliminated. But who else might be involved? What secrets did Margaret hold that threatened the palace's security? George and Charles no longer needed proof to know they were on the right track. They decided to confront Clark. The head of security seemed to be the link connecting Margaret's past to Alexander and Lennox's present. George didn't like the idea of confronting Clark directly, but Charles believed he could give them a crucial lead, or at least reveal some hesitation that would expose his true motte. When they arrived at Clark's office, the reception was cold. Clark looked at them with a hard expression, his penetrating eyes, as if trying to guess their intentions. Charles, with the frankness of a journalist accustomed to confrontations, got straight to the point. "We know about Operation Amethyst, Clark. We know you were involved with it, and that Margaret Wilson knew more than she should have. What's really going on?" Clark kept his expression impassive, but George noticed a slight tremor in his fingers. It was subtle, almost imperceptible but revealing. In a controlled tone, Clark replied, "Operation Amethyst was a security project, something to protect the monarchy from threats. Some things are too big to be understood by those on the outside." "And you think it's right to keep these threats buried?" Charles retorted, his voice loaded with indignation. "How many people paid with their lives to maintain this facade?" Clark looked away, and for a moment George thought he saw a glimmer of regret in his eyes. Sometimes keeping the secret is the only choice. Some truths are too dangerous to expose. "There are things the public doesn't need to know," he said, his voice sounding somber and resolute. George and Charles left the office under the weight of that statement. Would you continue with the truth, knowing it could destroy everything around you? Back at the cottage, Charles and George continued to pore over Margaret's diary, with the feeling that every line could reveal a vital fragment. They found a passage where Margaret made an enigmatic reference to a hidden connection. She mentioned that there were secret documents in a hidden safe, likely containing information that could finally clarify the plot. In the final entry, Margaret wrote something that sounded like a warning. "They will do everything to bury this truth, but if you've come this far, you must be prepared to face what's to come. The decision to expose it is yours." George closed the diary, his mind in turmoil. He and Charles were facing a dangerous choice. They knew what Margaret had faced and the price she had paid. And Clark had made it clear that he wouldn't hesitate to protect the monarchy. The decision to go forward or back haunted them. George knew the truth could destabilize the lives of those involved and that he himself was at risk. But Charles insisted that now was the time to expose everything. If they didn't, Margaret would have died in vain. The next morning, as he walked through the garden, George felt as though he was being watched. The atmosphere around him felt oppressive, as if the shadows between the trees were laden with imminent danger. It was a feeling that followed him, and he knew that Clark's words had only been the beginning. The threat was now palpable. Clark approached him, stopping beside him unceremoniously. "Alcott, you've gotten in too deep," he said in a dry, definitive tone. "Understand that what we're doing is for the good of the crown. Some truths are too dangerous to come to light." George hesitated, but the firm look in Clark's eyes made it clear that any misstep could be fatal. The decision to keep quiet or move forward was a choice between safety and duty. Would you continue, even knowing your life was at risk? Or would you retreat, knowing the truth was too risky to reveal? Clark cast him a final look before walking away, a look George knew he would never forget. George could no longer ignore the weight of what he knew. In the days following Clark's last warning, he noticed suspicious glances, where once there had only been cordiality. His co-workers treated him with a disguised coldness, and the head of security seemed to multiply along the corridors, always lurking, like a shadow following him wherever he went. Every day, George felt an internal pressure to expose what he had discovered. Margaret's diary, Clark's threats, Operation Amethyst itself, all of it painted a dark picture of those who claimed to power. And then there was Charles, who encouraged him to be brave and not succumb to fear. On a cold December afternoon, George walked through the gardens toward the old oak, where his work awaited him that morning. As he bent down to prune one of the nearby bushes, he heard footsteps behind him. Turning slowly, he saw Clark with a stern expression. "Alcott," Clark began, his tone too soft, almost threatening. "Do you know how far your loyalty can be trusted?" George, who avoided looking Clark directly in the eyes, took a deep breath and replied, "I don't understand what you mean, sir." Clark leaned in slightly, approaching George, and continued, now with a harsher tone. "There are secrets that aren't meant for everyone, Alcott, and if you continue to act the way you've been acting, I can assure you that the Crown won't hesitate to resolve complications." George felt his blood freeze. He knew Clark was serious, and that his words were not just empty threats. The head of security seemed willing to do anything to protect the system to which he had devoted his life. "I don't want any trouble, Clark. I'm just doing my job," George replied, trying to hide the tremor in his voice. Clark held his gaze for a few seconds before slowly walking away, with a cold smile that suggested he knew much more than George would like. And if Clark were truly willing to eliminate him to preserve the secrets, How far would you go, risking your own life to expose the truth? After his confrontation with Clark, George found himself at an internal crossroads. He knew that any step he took from that moment on could cost him his life. And even if he managed to expose everything, there was no guarantee that Prince Alexander or Lennox would be held accountable for the plot they kept secret. Charles remained determined to bring the truth to light, and his insistence brought George a sense of courage, though fear tempted him to abandon everything. During a meeting in the hidden cafe where they often talked, Charles looked at him directly, his face more serious than ever. "George, I know all this is dangerous, but remember what Margaret wrote. She knew she was at risk, and she still recorded everything. We can't let her voice die in vain." George looked away at the window, watching the raindrops run down the glass. He wanted to believe that what they were doing was right, but doubt consumed him, and deep down he knew that Charles was right. If they gave up now, Margaret would just be another forgotten victim of a corrupted system. After a long pause, he replied, his voice low but determined, "You're right, Charles, but we need to do this the right way. If we're not careful, they'll destroy us before we even have a chance." Charles nodded, understanding the seriousness of the decision they had both made. They knew that from that moment on, their lives would never be the same. Over the following weeks, George and Charles carefully planned every detail. The strategy was as follows: gather all the documents, Margaret's writings and Charles's notes, to create a detailed timeline of Prince Alexander and Lord Lennox's meetings, connecting the dots with the evidence they had obtained. Charles used his contacts in journalism to prepare a confidential investigative article. The plan was to send it to renowned international outlets, protecting their identities until the last moment, and ensuring that if anything happened to them, the story would come to light, exposing Clark, Lennox, and possibly the prince. At the same time, they had to deal with the constant threat from Clark, who seemed to sense that something was underway. Every meeting and phone call between George and Charles was monitored. Every word exchanged carried a risk. George continued his work in the gardens, trying to maintain an appearance of normality. But his eyes were always alert, watching every suspicious movement, every whispered conversation. He knew he was walking a fine line between revealing the truth and mortal danger. One night, while working in a more isolated area of the garden, George noticed strange activity near the old oak. Hiding behind a bush, he saw Clark talking in a low voice with a man he didn't recognize. The words were indistinct, but the urgent tone and tense expressions on the two men's faces made it clear that something serious was being discussed. George felt his heart race. Was Clark planning something against him, or was this part of a larger conspiracy? Finally, after weeks of careful investigation and meticulous planning, George and Charles made a discovery that would change everything. Hidden in a secret compartment in Margaret's old desk, they found a flash drive. With trembling hands, they inserted the device into Charles's computer. What they saw left them breathless. The flash drive contained detailed documents about Operation Amethyst, including the names of key figures involved, dates of secret meetings, and most shocking of all, evidence that Prince Alexander himself was at the center of a plan to radically reform the monarchy. "My God, George," Charles whispered, his eyes wide as he read through the documents. "This is much bigger than we imagined. The prince isn't just involved, he's the architect of all this." George felt as if the ground had disappeared beneath his feet. But why? Why would the prince do this? Charles continued reading, his expression growing graver. It seems he believes the monarchy in its current form is unsustainable. He wants to transform it into something more modern, more aligned with democratic values. But there are powerful people who will do anything to stop him. George realized the magnitude of what they had uncovered. This wasn't just a scandal. It was a quiet revolution happening behind the scenes of power. And they, two ordinary men, were at the epicenter of it all. Finally, the day of the release arrived. George and Charles met one last time at the cottage, their faces tense but determined. Charles looked at his friend with gratitude. "Without you, George, I would never have gotten this far. I don't know how this will end, but we did what was right." George nodded. He too felt that regardless of the consequences, at least they were fighting for the truth. And then they clicked the send button. The following days were a true whirlwind. After the documents were sent, the article was quickly accepted by a major international newspaper. One morning, as George performed his daily tasks in the garden, he felt his phone vibrate in his pocket. It was Charles. "We did it, George," he said, euphoric on the other end of the line. "The newspaper published the story. It's spreading." George felt a wave of adrenaline and fear wash over him. The secret that had been buried for so many years, protected by threats and manipulations, was finally in the spotlight. But he knew this was only the beginning. The exposure would bring consequences, and he would have to be ready to face them. Shortly after, local newspapers began to pick up the story, and the scandal spread like wildfire. Pressure on the palace and on Lennox grew by the day. Everyone demanded answers, and the royal family's silence only increased the speculation. Clark, who had until then maintained an expression of confidence, now seemed uneasy. The palace guards watched George more frequently, and he knew his actions were being monitored. He knew that his silence until now was a sign that something much bigger was about to happen. What would you do if you finally revealed the truth to the world, but knew that your own life could be the next price to pay? One dark, quiet night, as he walked home, George noticed a figure in the distance waiting for him at the end of the path. The figure, partially illuminated by a streetlight, advanced toward him, and as they got closer, he recognized Clark's cold expression. "Alcott," Clark began, his voice lower and more controlled than ever. "You made a grave mistake." George felt sweat trickle down his forehead, but kept his head up. He already knew Clark would take action, but he tried to prepare for what would come. "I can't let you destroy the monarchy with these irresponsible revelations," Clark continued, slowly advancing, his eyes fixed on George. "Remember, there are people who will give everything to preserve what we've built. Don't think you'll escape unscathed." George took a deep breath, gathering all the courage he could muster. "It's too late, Clark. The truth is already out there. There's no turning back now." For a moment, George saw what appeared to be fear in Clark's eyes. But soon, the head of security's expression hardened again. "You have no idea what you've unleashed, Alcott. The consequences will be—" Before Clark could finish, they were interrupted by a group of police officers who emerged from the shadows. At the head of them was Charles, accompanied by a man George recognized as a senior government official. "It's over, Clark," Charles said, his voice firm. "We have all the evidence. The government is aware of everything now." Clark looked around, realizing he was surrounded. His shoulders slumped, the reality of the situation finally hitting him. The government official approached George. "Mr. Alcott, on behalf of Her Majesty's government, I would like to thank you for your courage and dedication to the truth. What you and Mr. Martin have done will change the course of our country's history." George could hardly believe what he was hearing. Everything they had fought for, all the risks they had taken, had finally paid off. In the months that followed, the scandal involving Prince Alexander and Lord Lennox was thoroughly investigated. Confidential documents came to light and statements began to be taken. Lennox was removed from his position, and although the prince was protected by the family, he faced significant public pressure. George, now living with a constant sense of fear, felt satisfied that he had honored Margaret's memory and exposed the corruption surrounding the crown. Even with Clark's ongoing threats, he felt a freedom he had never known before. The palace, in turn, had to rethink its approach to security and transparency. George knew there would be no rewards or applause for him, but the sense of duty fulfilled would stay with him forever. And he was sure of one thing: the secrets he had courageously and sacrificially unearthed would forever change the relationship between the people and the monarchy. Clark, in a final blow, was removed from his position after investigations revealed his connection to Operation Amethyst. And Charles continued his career, his name respected among journalists who fought for the truth, grateful to have shared this mission with a man as honorable as George. In the end, the gardens of Hampton Court remained beautiful and untouched, but for George, they represented much more than a job. They were silent witnesses to a sacrifice, and the courage needed to expose lies and ensure that the legacy of those who dared to tell the truth would never be forgotten. Would you be able to fight for the truth, knowing your life could change forever? Or would you live in silence, choosing safety over justice?